Hello everyone. There's something new out there on the internets and it's called Fig. I have a few concerns about them, but let's start with the basics. What is Fig? Well, despite what this image would lead you to believe, no, Fig is not a recently reunited grunge band from the 90s. Fig is a crowdfunding platform for games, and what they're trying to do is very complicated, but I'm going to try to explain it concisely. It was started by Justin Bailey, who is a former developer from Double Fine. As you can see, Tim Schafer is involved as well. He sits on their advisory board. They're trying to differentiate themselves by offering equity as part of your pledge, so if a game becomes wildly successful, you might get a slice of those profits. This is something that's never been done before without heavy SEC regulation burning at both ends. They plan to do this by taking advantage of some new legislation that was passed as part of the Jobs Act. And the specific part that we're interested in just proves that there's someone in Washington with way too much time on their hands, because it was named the Capital Raising Online While Deterring Fraud and Unethical Non-Disclosure Act, or abbreviated as the Crowdfund Act. This will allow crowdfunding sites to act as funding portals and issue equity in their projects to backers of any size. They've already had one successful campaign to set the stage, and they will be starting another one very soon. But there's a problem. Those rules they hope to take advantage of have not been implemented by the Securities and Exchange Commission, so they can't use them yet. But that's not stopping Fig. They're still selling equity under the old rules of venture capital investing. That's why they can only offer equity to accredited investors for now. In order to be an accredited investor, you have to have made $200,000 for each of the past 2 years, or have a net worth of over $1 million. So as unfortunate as it may be, that eliminates most of us from buying equity from Fig. But keeping regular backers away from this type of investing might be a blessing in disguise. When I said that their campaign was a success, that really depends on how you qualify success, because it nearly wasn't. I remember the numbers weren't looking too healthy in the last week of the campaign. It seemed like they were going to end up a few $1,000s short, but to my surprise they inched past their goal of $125,000 needed to create the game Outer Wilds. Fig recently admitted to Polygon that $75,000 of the total they received was from investors buying equity in the game. Which does make sense, because when you add up all the money from all the funding tiers, it accounts for the remaining $50,000 or so. But think about it for a minute. 60% of the funding came from investors who wanted equity rather than people who just wanted to play the game. The site is currently just venture capital funding with some crowdfunding sprinkled on top. Or you can look at it another way. If this was on Kickstarter where they wouldn't be able to sell equity, the campaign would have failed. I'll be honest with you, I consider the Outer Wilds campaign to be a complete failure because it only narrowly escaped death row by the mercy of their venture capitalist investors. When venture capitalist funding is disguised as crowdfunding, it completely misrepresents the actual interest in the project from the community that's going to be buying and playing the game. Consider this, when you take out the higher tier backers and only look at the people who just wanted a digital or physical copy of the game, that's only 896 people who contributed a little over $24,000. And the overall funding figures were inflated by investors ever since the beginning. Because the site is so new, it's difficult to track how much they had on any particular date, but as this screenshot from Polygon shows, very early in their campaign they had 5 backers. Those 5 backers contributed $34,000. When it comes to crowdfunding, the simple fact is that we do look at the funding total to measure the hype. Shenmue 3, Bloodstained, or Yooka-Laylee are all measured by their millions. But on a site like Fig, you should worry about the total number of backers. The site has to sell these games as a good investment, but if no one's interested in the game, that's a pretty poor investment. If people aren't feeling the hype now, do you expect that to improve in the far future when it's finally released? You're only going to see a return on your investment if people are buying the game when it releases, and the backers who just want the game can be an early indicator of success or failure. So you really need to get that funding total out of your head and instead focus on how many people actually want the game. When the Crowdfund Act rules go into effect, your average Joe backer now turned investor probably doesn't realize this, and that's a dangerous thing, especially when Fig keeps hyping how much investor interest they've received. Did you know Outer Wilds received $750,000 in investment interest in the first 3 days? And then another $50,000 in investor interest, for a total of $800,000 of interest in Outer Wilds, and then $200,000 of investor interest in Fig itself. That's a dangerous thing to advertise because of something called the Ash effect. The Ash effect happens when someone is coerced into accepting an obviously false conclusion after being pressured to conform with a group. This leads to what's known as groupthink, and it's similar to the argument from authority that we looked at last time. When a site like Fig starts advertising that they're getting hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in venture capital funding, that in itself could lead people to believe that this is a good investment. After all, how could those venture capitalist investors be wrong about this? I'd be a fool to pass up this opportunity. The Ash effect works on just plain old Kickstarter as well. I think people just can't help but get worked up by a business venture that's raising boatloads of cash. Every now and then I find myself getting hyped up by a Kickstarter campaign that's going viral. When I texted a friend about the Shenmue 3 announcement, I didn't tell him about the graphics or gameplay. I told him about how much money they raised so far. And I can only imagine this getting worse when we add investments into the mix to inflate that funding total. And that actually leads us to how this trend can be corrected. The problem I have is when huge amounts of cash from investors is combined with reward tier backers, because to a newcomer that makes the game look more enticing and more successful than it's actually performing from a sales perspective. It would help if it could separate the two figures so we can see how interested the crowd really is in getting the actual game. Which is, some very meaningful information when your investment return depends on people buying the game in the future. But I'm not expecting Fig to do that, because of course that little effect we just learned about earlier tells us the bigger they can make that figure, the more likely you are to join in. They want all the benefits of crowdfunding and venture capital investing wrapped into one. What's good for Fig is good for you. The next Fig campaign starts today, and it's coming from a well-known studio, so I suspect it will do better than Outer Wilds. But keep an eye on those numbers, because they might not be what they seem. But before we end, there is a silver lining in all of this. Fig ultimately wants to use that crowdfunding act to sell equity when the SEC gives us the green light. But do you remember what the crowdfunding act stood for? It's not just a cute name. They really do mean the whole while deterring fraud and unethical non-disclosure part of it. Crowdfunding creators are known to embellish or provide outright misleading information. But the crowdfunding act took that into account and they're giving you some protection. A liability clause was included so that if they were to sell equity based on false or misleading information, or even if they omit information that would have made something not misleading, and you could not reasonably have known about it, then they can be held liable for that. I usually end these crowdfunding stories by telling you guys to be careful out there, but this time it's a little different. Fig, be careful out there. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.